Hi folks, this is just a brief video lecture on playtime, Arnhem, and the notion of defamiliarization. It's a way of bringing a lot of the loose ends of our discussion of playtime together. I'm going to do a little bit of summary of what we talked about and add a little bit where I wanted to go to with our discussion in the last few minutes. So recall that we were focusing a lot on this notion that Arnhem brings up in his text. The notion of a twofold effect. A twofold effect, he says, can be produced by a clever position of the camera. If an artistic impression is to be achieved, this double effect is necessary. It must not only show the subject in characteristic fashion, but must at the same time satisfy the spectator's sense of form. So this is kind of where we started, and the presenters did a great job showing where this might reveal itself. It's something that Arnhem looks at in the Charlie Chaplin films, right? When you have one thing and it's framed in such a way and within its narrative context that it makes you see it in two different ways simultaneously. And Arnhem thinks that that is a characteristic possibility of cinematic form and also illustrates something about the way visual perception works, that we can see one thing as two separate things at the same time, or at least back and forth. So think about just all the ways in which you'll see that in the film Playtime, just to remind you of what that looks like. So something like this, where the waiter is pouring into what looks like he's watering flowers, but really what he's doing is he's pouring drinks that are located perfectly behind the flowers. So it creates a visual gag, and a visual gag in this sense is purely cinematic. It can't be achieved in theater, and it can't be achieved for a group of people if they have different vantage points. The same kind of thing in a simpler way can be achieved here. The placement of the priest with respect to the camera creates this twofold effect. We can think about the term twofoldness or the related term partial illusion more broadly as being exemplified by the fact that this film was shot on a set of elaborately, meticulously constructed sets that looked different from how they would appear in actual perception. So look at this shot of Tativille. It looks as if the array of buildings is merely identically sized buildings that are just receding in space, when in fact the reality is that the buildings were built, as most sets are built, purely for the way that they would be seen by a camera, to create the illusion that these are actual buildings. And when I give you an array of photographs of Tativille, the set that Jacques Tati had built for this film, you'll see that these facades, sometimes three-dimensional structures, appear differently sized than the impression that they give in the film. So we have two kinds of twofoldness, which goes along with Arnhem. These are the film techniques for creating gags, but what about Playtime as a film with themes? What about what Playtime is about? Can we link up that discussion with Rudolf Arnhem? And this is where we were talking about the idea of modernization of the cosmopolitan. This is where we get to some of the historical thematics of the film. And you can see that on display throughout the film, but it's particularly useful to look at a sequence like this one.
Barbara, come here. Let's see the sights. From what the book says, that should be... Let me see. The Pont Alexandre III. I'm sure it is. That'll be a good picture. Okay? Let's go.
Excuse me, would you mind? That's really Paris. Hey, Donna.
Oh, the flowers.
We don't mind.
Sure.
Oh, that's all right. Madame,
Regardez
it's just fine. Good.
So, as you'll remember, this sequence continues to go on, and the gag becomes more and more elaborate as different people who are markedly not Parisian, but are signified by other nations, come in and disrupt the attempt at an authentic photograph of something distinctly Parisian, right? We have this woman selling flowers, and she says, our American tourist says, that is Paris. She wants to get a photograph of this image as separate from the background from all of the tourists, because there's this tension in this film between the cultural specificity of Paris as being eroded by the flattening of cultural distinction with modern architecture, with modernism more generally, right? This gray, clean, modern lines, steel and glass, which you can also see in the joke here when she takes a photograph of what would be in its place a distinct Parisian landmark, but here a skyscraper that looks indistinct from all the other skyscrapers or modern buildings. And of course the joke is being hammered home here when you get these travel posters of various countries in which their distinction is being flattened by modern architecture. So we have this question, right? This film seems to be absolutely about the way in which the world is changing toward a cosmopolitan aesthetic that potentially erodes cultural distinction and maybe erodes something that we might call organicity or humanity, and things are becoming more robotic. And you can see that in an image like this, and all throughout the first half of the film when Tati's character, Ulo, is kind of meandering through this dead gray space when all of these white men in identical gray suits turn around identically and look more or less indistinguishable from each other. And so you can think about this issue with respect to Rudolf Arnheim's interest in what's happening to the senses if we don't think about the aesthetic, about form. So there's a sterility of the senses, we might say, that's illustrated in the sterility of the visual or of the aesthetic in Playtime, and what Arnheim thinks is just a condition of what happens when we don't consider the aesthetic. So Arnheim will write, it's a well-known fact that many married couples do not know the color of each other's eyes, that people are ignorant of the very pictures hanging on the walls of their dining rooms. It is indeed exceptional for anyone suddenly to lose himself in gratuitous contemplation, to watch his neighbor's hands, to examine the telephone for its shape, to observe the play of shadows on the pavement. He's interested in the way that film takes a view upon a world that is familiar to us, but in its doing so can manipulate our perception and possibly actually infuse our minds with a way of changing our perception of the ordinary world. He wants you to see, in other words, the unfamiliar in a familiar object, right? Another image similar to the one before. He says, the strangeness and unexpectedness of this view have the effect of a clever coup d'esprit to get a fresh angle on a thing. It brings out the unfamiliar in a familiar object. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this term defamiliarization, and it's not a term that Arnheim uses, but we can get the general idea that he aims for film as a tool of perceptual defamiliarization. He thinks that doing certain techniques in a film can amount to it, but also he thinks film has potential to do this on a broader scale, given these kinds of lines in his writing. And in one sense, we can think about the trajectory of Playtime as going from the sterility of a gray world with geometric shapes and right angles to a world that reacts to this, or maybe that bubbles up on the suppression of the senses, right? We go from here to here to here, and finally in the dinner sequence, or rather in the restaurant sequence, we have perceptual chaos, right? We talked about how gray and boring and lifeless the opening of the film is. Well, it does that for a purpose, because it almost wants you to feel the suffocation, so that you can feel a kind of liberation in this last or penultimate sequence. But it does something beyond that. It doesn't just go from form to chaos, it also returns to the world of the Parisian metropolis, the cosmopolitan metropolis, and allows us to see forms within it as something different than what it merely functions as. Remember the carnival music. The film wants us to see a roundabout as a kind of carousel. It wants us to see this car mechanic shop and the oscillation of the two cars as a kind of carnival ride. Remember this moment talked about in the presentation, which I'll talk about in a moment, but simply it creates a moment where the bus riders are on a kind of carnival ride, and you get the arm of this construction device also being infused with a kind of play. It brings out the unfamiliar in a familiar object. And you can think about the character of Hulot as almost unintentionally doing this throughout the entire film. Think about color. We talked about how gray the film is. And just consider this moment at 40 minutes in my experience, my memory of the film, the first splash of real color coming from an orange source of light that Hulot turns on, right? And I think we experience this as a shock, even if we're not aware that it's a shock because of the gray color palette. Also, the way that towards the end of the film, other characters within the world of the film will take on that twofold effect that was mostly intended for the privilege of the audience's point of view. So one of my favorite gags here is when this drunken lost person in the restaurant is looking for directions. Hulot lays out a map right next to this marble surface, and there's a moment when the drunk man sees the marble as a kind of map, and it makes us see the way in which the striations of a marbled surface also look very much like the lines and roads in a map. Same thing here. This is in many ways like the other sight gags in the film when the chef looks like Napoleon, but importantly, one of the American wealthy tourists says something to the effect of, "See, Napoleon, it's not just for us, it's actually for a character in the film as things start to go awry." And that's where I want to bring in this moment once again. Really nicely talked about in the presentation. And of course, there's a kind of confusion going on here because it would seem to only make sense for the viewer that this appears to be a kind of carnival ride, because we have the privileged position of seeing the way in which the bus launches up when its reflection is being bent in a particular way. You'll notice that none of the bus riders actually are looking at their own reflection in the window. They're looking forward. But there's this way in which the two things are conflated for Tati, right? Play starts to take over. The characters react to the way in which the camera eye sees them, even though they are diegetically unaware of the camera eye, right? This is that kind of making others and us see differently. And of course, the final gesture is, I think, a light and touching and charming one, but I think really kind of sells this trajectory. Hulot, when he is interacting with the American tourist in the last few moments of the film, buys her these little metallic or plastic flowers. And the tourist looks at them and then looks up and notices that the streetlights have the same kind of form. And I think that's an important gesture. We were talking about the question of whether this film is pessimistic about the encroaching modernization and cosmopolitanization of the world, whether that is a kind of pessimism, or whether the film is optimistic despite the inevitability of this kind of aesthetic and cultural shift. And here it seems important, right, that there is a preservation of humanity, or importantly, the organic, right? The flower form, which is distinctly opposed to the artificial form of the rectangular skyscraper. It's important that there seems to be a gesture of optimism, perhaps, right? In the character seeing the organic, or seeing the human or beauty in the forms that are embedded in in architecture. You could also take this as deeply ironic and not at all a sincere or optimistic gesture. But it's important that we see that this hinges upon perception, right? A way of seeing this not for its function, that it is literally just a industrially produced light post, but rather it is also a form, something that in its pure form resembles the organic shape of this flower. So that's all I wanted to say about Arnheim and Playtime. Just a way of bringing together the film and the text in a kind of complete way. I'll see you next time.